Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host Demo, and this is Atraxa Sagas. Or I guess you could probably also think of this as Saga Tribal. Sagas came out in Dominaria a couple years ago, and you know, most of them weren't great. And more Sagas came out in Theros Beyond Death, and it started to get to a point where it's like, okay, is there something here? Is there something? Could you make a deck with this? But I think there still wasn't enough good ones. There was enough, just not enough good ones to actually make a deck out of it. But now Kaldheim has come out, and there are definitely enough Sagas now to actually make a deck around. So how do you make a Saga deck? Obviously, they're enchantments, okay? So that there's going to be a little bit of a theme there, but more importantly, they're putting counters on themselves, right? I think the way you can make a Saga deck is by manipulating, not necessarily adding, manipulating the amount of counters on your Sagas to get the effect that you want. That's why I think Atraxa is great, because we can add counters at the beginning of our end step if we want to, right? We can play one of our Sagas, we'll get a counter right away, right? It comes into play, we get that first counter, and then we can proliferate on our end step and get another counter. We can immediately get that second effect, and we don't have to wait for our next main phase, which is great. But more importantly, we also want to remove counters. We want to be doing both. We want to be adding and removing, so we can fluctuate back and forth and keep getting those effects over and over and over again, right? The adding counters part is easy. Atraxa is going to take care of that. Sagas add counters on their own. They're going to be putting counters on themselves no matter what. So really, the removing counters is the most important part. So cards that we are removing counters with. Aether Snap is a card that was printed in the, originally it was in Mirrodin, and then it was printed in the first Commander set, because I guess Wizards of the Coast thought that it would be great in Commander, and I agree. Remove all counters from all permanents and exile all tokens. That's really powerful. First of all, it kills all planeswalkers. People probably don't realize this, but Aether Snap just kills all planeswalkers. All planeswalkers will have all their counters removed and they'll just die. This can be a blowout a lot of times. It's just a really powerful effect that can really do some damage in games. And you think, okay, well, do we want to remove all the counters from our Sagas? And I think a lot of times we will. I think if we have a couple of Sagas in play, we're basically resetting them back to the beginning, right? And I think that's really good. Like I said, they're going to run through their different levels. We can't stop them from doing that, right? So I think setting them back to zero is actually going to be really good. Ideally, what we want in this deck is removing one counter at a time. We want to be nitpicky about it, right? Chisei Heart of Oceans is a good one. I'm assuming if there's anyone out there that has a Chisei Heart of Oceans deck, and I applaud you if you do, because it's a very interesting commander, you're going to have some Sagas in there because they fit really good with a Chisei deck. We're going to just remove a counter. If there's any of our Sagas on the battlefield that we want to reuse the last effect that it just had, we remove a counter from it, and then on our main phase, it'll go again, right? Ferropede is a great one. I've had this in a couple of decks. It's unblockable, so you're just going to attack with it every turn, and then you're going to remove a counter from a permanent. A lot of these effects, even though we are putting them in here for us, they can be used on our opponents too, so don't forget that. Hex Parasite's going to be great because we can remove any number of counters if we want to reset our Saga back to zero. I also really like Power Conduit. Power Conduit's going to be great because we can remove a counter from one of our Sagas, and then we can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, which is important because this is a proliferate deck, right? So we can put a +1/+1 counter on our Atraxa, who then is going to proliferate and make herself bigger. So this one works really good in the deck. Thief of Blood, again, another one like Aether Snap that is going to remove all counters. This one can reset all of our Sagas back to zero again, which is great. And also it's going to give us a really big flyer. It's going to remove all the counters. This is probably an underplayed card, just like with Aether Snap. This can be a blowout a lot of the times, right? And then I got Thrall Parasite and Vampire Hexmage. It's definitely helpful to be able to remove these counters at instant speed so we can really manipulate. The pay 2 life isn't great, but that's fine. And Vampire Hexmage, we can just remove all the counters from one of our Sagas if we want to. And Nesting Grounds, this guy is going to be great. Obviously, we can move a counter from target permanent onto another target permanent. So we can move our lore counters from one Saga to another. Again, it's all about manipulate. Okay, we want this effect on this Saga, so we're going to move it over, and we're going to reset that other one to go back and use that effect again. The idea of the deck is we're moving those counters around, removing them, adding them to not only get the effect we want, but keep reusing those effects as much as we can. So we're playing an Atraxa deck, and I'm sort of breaking a lot of my own rules here, first of all, because I purposely avoid popular commanders. However, I've been wanting to make a Atraxa deck for a long time. It's one of the first decks I ever made in the format, like I said, and she just works so good with the Sagas that, I just can't possibly use anyone else. So since we have Atraxa as our commander, I'm going to go over we're playing Atraxa, so we might as well be using these cards anyways type of stuff. Coalition, Relic, and Replicating Ring are just, if we're going to be putting mana rocks in our deck anyway, we might as well be putting these. I talked about how Replicating Ring, I think, isn't great. However, I had made the suggestion to try it out in an Atraxa deck, and since I'm making a Atraxa deck, I'm going to try it out. Empowered Auto Generator is another one. This one doesn't get played. Man, I don't think I've ever seen this in a game. It is a little slow and enters the battlefield tap, but if you think about it, our first turn we use it, put a counter on it, and then we're going to proliferate on our end step. So already it's got 2, and then on our next turn it's going to tap for 3, right? So I think this is going to be good in this deck. I put Azor's Elocutors in here because it is a win con. We're playing Sagas here, and I've played this deck a couple times already. You need a couple of win cons like this in this deck because Sagas aren't going to win you the game. Really, the only win con, Atraxa is going to attack and kill our opponents. There's not a lot of big creatures in this deck. None of the Sagas are going to be doing anything really that's going to be killing our opponents, so it's good to have stuff like this in the deck. Ludwig's Test Subject. This is a card that I just think, man, why not? The problem with Atraxa is every Atraxa deck I've ever seen is either a Super Friends deck, a +1/+1 counters deck, or a Infect deck. That seems to be the only ways people go with them, and because those are powerful ways of going about an Atraxa deck, and so many cards like Ludwig's Test Subject, nobody ever plays them, even though it works great in a deck like this, right? I mean, you can just put one counter on it and then just proliferate after that, and it's going to eventually turn into a 13/13 trample creature with very little effort. Saproling Burst is another one. Saproling Burst was a monster back in the day. I think this is actually in a World Championship deck. So it's got Fading 7. Right? You remove a fade counter from it and you create a Saproling creature token that's power and toughness is equal to the number of fade counters on it. So what you're going to do is you're going to remove one right away. And the first one you remove is going to be a 6/6. The only problem is it's going to get smaller. Your next turn on your upkeep, you're going to remove a fade counter and it's going to become a 5/5. But because we're playing Atraxa, we're going to keep proliferating. I just think this is great in this deck, especially since we're also playing, a lot of enchantments and we have a lot of enchantment support. So I think this fits really well in the deck. Steelbane Hydra. This is a card that, again, nobody really plays. I think this is great. We can just put one counter on it, and because we're proliferating every turn we get a Crossing Grip and we destroy an artifact or enchantment. Another card that I'm really surprised doesn't get played in more Atraxa decks, Transmogrifying Wand. Again, another card, like we can just destroy a creature every turn. They get a 2/4 White Ox. Okay, who cares, right? And then because we are removing counters, again, I always got to have secondary strategies. I got to have something. We're going to be removing counters anyway, so there's a couple cards I wanted to try out. Chronozoa seems interesting. It has Vanishing 3. This permanent comes into play with 3 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove one, and when the last one is removed, you sacrifice it. So when Chronozoa is put into the graveyard from play, if it had no counters on it, put 2 tokens into play that are copies of it. So basically what this is it just keeps reproducing and reproducing, right? If we go to remove a counter and there isn't any, it dies, right? And then it's going to create 2 copies, and then those 2 copies, same thing. The counters are going to get removed and they just multiply, and it keeps multiplying and it keeps multiplying. And this is a card that I think, no one's going to really pay attention to it. You could throw this on the table and it'll just sit there and keep multiplying. But because we have all these remove counter effects, man, I think we can really go to town with this card if it gets left unchecked. And then I have Celestial Convergence. This is a card that I've been wanting to try out in a deck for a while. I thought this would combo really cool with Solemnity, right? Because it would come into play with no counters on it. And then if you had the highest life, you would win, right? So it comes into play with 7 Omen counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove one. And then when there are no counters left on it, the player with the highest life total wins the game. if you're playing a life gain deck and you're guaranteed to have the highest life, this could just be a good card. In an Atraxa deck, remember, Atraxa's got lifelink, so it's almost assured that we're going to have the most life, probably. If we're not, then we're just not going to play this. But yeah, this can just be Celestial Convergence, and then we remove all the counters with Hex Parasite, and then we win. Or we remove all the counters with Aether Snap, and then we win, right? Interesting card. Again, I wanted to have a couple of alternate win cons in the deck just because there isn't a ton with the Sagas. So getting to the Sagas, right? That's what this deck is all about. It's all about the Sagas. There's only 10. Okay, I know that's not a lot, but I figure because we're going to be reusing the abilities, having 1 or 2 in play at a time is going to be enough. Binding of the Old Gods, this was in my top 20 Kaldheim cards. I think it's fantastic. I think the best Sagas are the ones that have the first ability is the one you want the most. And then the second ability is the second best, and then the third ability is the one you really don't care about. Because then you don't really have to wait, you don't have to hope that you get it. The first ability you're guaranteed to get, and then the second one, if you get it, okay, that's good. And the third one, it's like, whatever. If it doesn't stick around, if your opponents remove it, then no big deal, right? So Binding of the Old Gods is fantastic. It's probably the best example of this, where destroying an on-land permanent is the thing you want the most. Then go get a forest card out of your deck. That's great too. Creatures you control gain Death Touch. Who cares? That really does nothing for us. So this is the perfect card for this deck because we want to keep it between the 1 and the 2. We want to keep removing counters so that it keeps going back to destroy a permanent. And I actually, I've played this a couple times and I got this card out. So I had my Power Conduit out and I had Binding of the Old Gods, just to give you an idea of how this whole process works, right? So I had my Power Conduit out. I play Binding of the Old Gods, destroy a non-land permanent, right? And then I remove a counter because I see another permanent that I want to remove that my opponents have. So I remove a counter. Now my Binding of the Old Gods has no counters on it. And I just put a charge counter on I had no creatures in play, so I just put a charge counter on my Power Conduit. I mean, I was like, whatever, it does nothing, but who cares, right? I remove the counter. So then on my next main phase, Binding the Old Gods goes, okay, we have no counter, so we put a counter on. And then I get the destroy permanent effect again, and I destroy something else, right? And then I play my Atraxa that turn, right? So I put Atraxa down, and then on my end step, I need to ramp, so I proliferate. And now there's 2 counters on Binding of the Old Gods. And I go get a forest card out of my deck, and it's not a forest, basic forest, it's any forest, right? So I can get a breeding pool, I can get an overgrown tomb, right? Which makes it great for this deck because it's a 4-color deck. And then I remove a counter, right? So when I remove a counter, now we're back down to 1. Now I can go ramp again, right? And that's essentially what you want to be doing with this deck, right? Elspeth Conquers Death. This one's going to be great too. Again, the exile a permanent and opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater is probably the one we're going to want to use the most. The second one is okay. The third one's pretty good too, actually. I like the idea of reusing that first ability over and over and over again. I really like Birth of Meletus. This one's really an underrated card. I put this in all my mono white decks. I also like Follow the Imposter. Again, another one that's not super powerful, but putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature is important. Virge's Retribution. So this one works because Atraxa is an angel, right? So we're going to create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. So again, we can just keep reusing this effect. We can keep removing those counters and get more angels if we want. Or if we want the second effect, until end of turn, angels you control gain tap, destroy target creature with power less than this creature's power. There's a bunch of creatures we want to destroy, and again, Atraxa is an angel, so we can use this with Atraxa, or we can use it with whatever angel tokens we have. We can keep reusing that effect if we want to remove creatures from the board. Kiora Best the Sea God. So this one's great. This is this is the one that could possibly end the game. You create an 8/8 blue creature token. We reuse this one a couple times. We're going to have an army of hexproof Krakens. That's pretty fantastic. Or we can use it to lock down an opponent, right? Tap all non-land permanents target opponent controls. They don't untap. So we can just tap all of our opponent's permanents and keep doing that. If there's a threat on the board, say there's a guy who has a giant army and he's about to crush us, we can just keep tapping all his creatures every single turn and keeping them locked down. And then of course the last one's great too, but I honestly, gain control of a permanent opponent controls seems like maybe the best one here. I don't think it is though. I think the first one is the best, and it's going to be a win con for us. Phyrexian Scriptures, I really like this a lot. Talked about this in my Fearja deck tech. This is sort of a Dune Blast a little bit, right? So in particular in this deck, really this should be put in every Atraxa deck, I think. So you're going to put this in play, okay? Put a +1/+1 counter on up to one target creature. So you're going to put that on your Atraxa. So now your Atraxa is a 5/5. You go to your end step and you're going to proliferate. So you get that second, that destroy all non-artifact creatures, you're going to get it right away. Your Atraxa is an artifact, so it's going to survive. You also get to proliferate that +1/+1 counter, so now your Atraxa is a 6/6. I mean, man, this just seems so good in an Atraxa deck because you can use those first two effects immediately. All of these, right? All of these sagas you can use, and that's why I like Atraxa so much. All of these effects, if you want, you can use the first two abilities right away. You can have it come out, use the first ability, and then on your end step, you can proliferate and get the second ability right away. I like the first Iron games. There are some sagas, they're not all super fantastic, but there are some that if we get them in the sweet spot, right? And this one has 4, which is interesting. Again, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Who cares about that, right? What we want is the 2 middle ones, right? That's what we want. We want those middle, the meaty part in the middle. That's the important part because we can keep it in that range. Put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. That's pretty good. Now our Atraxa is a 7/7 and we get to proliferate it. So it's going to get huge. But also if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw 2 cards. You know, we can keep doing that over and over and over again. That's fantastic. If we can keep removing counters and every single turn we're drawing 2 cards, that's amazing. So this one, even though at first it might look underwhelming, it can be really good in this deck. So that is the sagas. It's not a lot, but we do have a lot of support. Okay, we need support. So what do we have for supporting our sagas? Well, we have Board the Weatherlight. It's going to look at the top 5 cards of our library. You're going to reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand, right? And a historic, of course, is artifacts, anything legendary, and sagas. So ideally we want to get a saga out of this, but we can also just get an artifact. You know, we can get a legendary creature, which we do have a couple. I really like Curator's Ward. Curator's Ward is an enchant permanent. Enchant permanent has hexproof. So we can just put this on our Atraxa. Give it hexproof if we're worried about it getting removed. And then if the enchanted permanent leaves the battlefield, if it's historic, you get to draw 2 cards, which is pretty good. So if our Atraxa dies, we get to draw 2 cards. However, this is an enchant permanent. This makes any permanent have hexproof. You know, this is probably a criminally underplayed card. So we can put this card on one of our sagas, right? If we have a saga, like say we have Binding the Old Gods and we're just going to town with it, or I have Kiora, Best the Sea God on the battlefield, and I just keep cranking out these 8/8 tokens, I can throw Curator's Ward on it, and now it has hexproof, and I don't have to worry about my opponents removing it. Wrath Capuchin, again, historic spells, all of our sagas, like this is particularly good with sagas because giving all of our sagas flash means, again, we can flash it out on our opponent's turn. When it enters the battlefield, we get that first effect, and then on our main phase, we get the second effect right away. So it's a great way to get through those first 2 effects quickly. And then I like Sentinel of the Pearl Trident. He has flash, so when Sentinel of the Pearl Trident enters the battlefield, you may exile target historic permanent you control. If you do, return it. So it's blinking a historic permanent. So we can use this to save our Atraxa or something, but we can also use it to reset our sagas, right? Let's say we got Elspeth Conqueror's Death, right? Elspeth Conqueror's Death, that third one triggers, the trigger goes on the stack. We can then blink it. We can shoot in our Sentinel of the Pearl Trident. It is going to exile our Elspeth Conqueror's Death. We still get the effect because it's already on a stack. We return something from a graveyard to the battlefield, and then it comes back into play on the end step, exiles a permanent, and we get to start all over again. And then, of course, sagas are enchantments, so we need enchantment support. I really like Ephemeral Enchantress in this deck. Of all the enchantresses, this is the one you never see. 2 mana, it's just whenever an enchantment is put into a graveyard from play, draw a card. So it's sort of like the reverse of most enchantresses. I just think it's neat. I always like to throw a card like this in all my decks. Also have Enchantress's Presence. I didn't put a lot of those effects in here. I think just having a couple is good enough. I do have Enlightened Tutor and I do have an Idyllic Tutor. You know, you can put them in or not. Tutors can tend to be expensive. However, it's always going to help you. I mean, listen, we're in black. We can put Vampiric Tutor. You can put all the tutors you want in this deck if you want to. If you have them, if you can afford them, whatever the case may be. I just happen to put these 2 in. You can put whatever tutors you like. Search for Glory is good though. Search for Glory is going to search for a snow permanent card, a legendary card, or a saga card. For us, this is an Idyllic Tutor. right? Because we're just going to go get a Saga out of our deck, so that works good. The problem with Sagas is they do run their course a lot of times and then just go to the graveyard and then you've got nothing left. So we're going to want effects that get them back. Obviously, Replenish is the best of the bunch. Being able to get back 3 or 4 Sagas all at once is just going to be too good to pass up. Dance of the Manse is another one. This is a newer one. So return up to X target artifacts and or non-aura enchantments, which Sagas are. They're not auras. Each with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So say we pay 4, right? We pay 4, so 6 mana. We're going to return up to 4 artifacts and or enchantments. So we can return artifacts too. We do have a fair amount of artifacts in this deck, don't forget. And they all are converted mana cost 4 or less. I think that's pretty good. And then if we do 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creature. You know, I don't think we want to do that. I actually don't think you ever want to play 6 for this. You want to do 5 or less because we don't want them to be creatures. Starfield and Nyx, though, is going to be the powerhouse in this deck. You know, and I didn't even realize how good it was until I started using it. Again, the second ability, as long as you control 5 or more enchantments, each enchantment you control is a creature. We never want that. I don't know if any enchantment does. It's actually a downside because then a Wrath of God is going to destroy all your enchantments. So we never want that, and it probably isn't going to happen because we're only going to have maybe 2 Sagas in play at a time. This isn't a super heavy enchantment deck, which I like because, again, then a Bane of Progress is not a complete blowout for us. But Starfield and Nyx is super good because when you use it, so at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an enchantment from your graveyard into the battlefield, which is great in any enchantment deck. But in a Saga deck, we're going to get our Binding of the Old Gods out of our graveyard. It comes into play and we immediately get that first ability. So on our upkeep, we get the Destroy Target Permanent ability. Then on our main phase, immediately after that, we get to go search for a forest card. So again, we're getting those first 2 effects right out of the gate. Kiora Best the Sea God, right? We get that back with our Starfield and Nyx, and we get the 8/8 token right away, and then we get the second ability right after that. And then if we have Atraxa in play, we can proliferate at the end of our turn and get the third ability. So we can work through all 3 abilities in one turn. It sacrifices, go to the graveyard, and then the next turn we get it back and start again. Again, there's a lot of, you know, sort of engineering and figuring. There's a lot of facets, right? There's a lot of things kind of going on all at once, which the difficulty level I think is going to be a little bit higher for this deck. For that reason, you're really going to have to pay attention. Makes the difficulty level a little bit higher, but we're really excited about this deck. I've played it a few times. It's tons of fun. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in.